Okay, so it's Damp and Mould Action and Awareness Week, and we've got a special guest here today, influencer, fame of indoor air quality and ventilation specialist. Very privileged to have you in today, Simon. Really pleased that we can have you here to talk about some of these issues in the sector, and hopefully we've got, speaking to you over the last couple of days, there's been you've got an unbelievable amount of knowledge around the built environment with the work that you've done before, and obviously speaking to experts on your podcast. What kind of advice? I think that's what people listening will want to know is everyone's tackling these really difficult damp and mold problems at the moment. What kind of advice would you give them?
Yeah, what's Simon's silver bullet for solving the damp and mold crisis?
Yeah. You just need to do one thing.
What's the one? What's the one thing? Yeah,
and it can't cost too much.
No, exactly. Yeah, I mean, that's. I think that's just it, isn't it? It's such a complex problem, and I think we're in this period of time. I get this sense we're in this period of time with housing where we know this is a long-term problem. This is something that has been around for time immemorial, right? Anybody that's been in housing has been battling damp and mould forever.
Yeah.
But it feels like we're at a point in time where things are changing, that there's a change in recognition of the problem, and there's a change in how we frame the challenge of how we fix this. And the Housing Ombudsman has quite rightly pointed out that this is not a lifestyle.
Big cultural change happening now.
Oh yeah, completely. But that doesn't remove the realpolitik out of this, and that is that condensation, damp and mould in homes, and often we refer to that in the built environment as moisture imbalance, this idea that there's a healthy balance for moisture in buildings. Buildings will always have moisture in them. Yeah. They both have to protect us from environmental moisture. We introduce moisture in the ventilation and the heating systems and the bathing and cooking and activities that we introduce in spaces. So there is always going to be moisture in buildings, but buildings should be designed and work in a way where they reach a point where there's a healthy balance.
Yeah.
There's neither not too much or too little, because we can have too little.
Yeah, viruses and things like that. You're more susceptible to viruses. And
completely.
Dehydration.
Yeah, and there are parts of the world, particularly in the colder climates and particularly in the hotter climates, where we tend to condition spaces more aggressively because of the extremes of the environment, where too little moisture is a real problem.
Yeah.
Right. So there's a healthy balance, and we understand quite well where that's at. But buildings are complex and nuanced spaces, and they would be much simpler if we didn't have to put people in them. All our jobs would be much easier if we just built empty boxes. So it's always going to be complex. So generally when I speak, I'm an air quality and ventilation person, so I tend to speak from a place of ventilation and air quality on this.
Yeah. But it's a great place to come at it from, though.
Oh, for sure. And it's without question one of the principal pillars for the outcomes that we see. But generally when we talk about moisture in buildings and moisture balance, there are typically kind of four pillars as we describe them. One of them is fabric related, and that often is about keeping the moisture out of buildings, and that the fabric being of an efficiency where it's not at a point where it's constantly at dew point, where it's at the point of temperature where normal levels of moisture are condensating on surfaces. So we cast our minds back to the single pane window days and those kind of things where we'd see a lot of moisture on cold surfaces. So the fabric is a really important place, but generally that's not my area. That tends to be for surveyors and people that are dealing with things like rising damp and retrofit and building fabric challenges.
Yeah.
One of the other pillars, though, fundamentally is the systems. So the heating systems, the ventilation systems that control the environment of the space, and they obviously interact very closely with our use of the space, which is the other principal pillar, the amount of people that we cram into a box, the activities that they produce when they're in that box, all contribute to the amount of moisture in the environment. And though that interplay between those two pillars is really where I operate a lot of the time in how we communicate to the people that live in those spaces, and the performance of the systems in those spaces to deal with the moisture that's generated. And that's where it gets quite complex. You know, we think the building fabric is a complex environment. You start dealing with habits and behaviour and environmental systems, and it becomes right complicated, right quick, and that's the challenge.
Yeah, so I was just saying, you talk about ventilation as a sort of, a key element in the system. I know that's where you kind of specialise and come from, but what I think is interesting is quite often people talk about root cause, but actually quite often it's root causes. There's multiple different things, and actually, you talked about earlier, overcrowding, retrofit, holding moisture in more and more, making problems worse. And I think with ventilation, it's just speaking to people that are sort of out on the coalface of it, quite often is the actual underlying issue. So it's the root cause itself. But even if it's not, maybe the root cause is a leak. At least if you have a very good ventilation system, you're massively reducing the sort of health risk factor in that home, because you're ripping out more of the sort of spores from the mould itself. So I think that's a really interesting point. Can you speak to some of particularly with ventilation? We saw that we were talking earlier on about the study that Tim Sharp I think was involved in about the amount of like ventilation that doesn't meet building standards in the UK. I think it was 70% or something ridiculous. What's gone wrong? What's gone wrong here? How have we found ourselves in this position where ventilation's just not adequate?
Well, I think I always like to break it down into simple streams of language for people, so that we can understand what the intent of ventilation is, why it exists, and how we might measure what a good outcome is in the context of the purpose of that intent. So what I mean by that is that we can generally describe the intent of ventilation I use the word pillars again, but in this case 3 pillars. The first pillar of ventilation is background ventilation or general ventilation, and that's the idea that there should be a total amount of air renewal that happens in a space that stops the build-up of pollutants over time. So it's a ventilation element that should be there the whole time, and it's delivering an amount of air renewal that stops us building up high levels of moisture in a building, where we start to see moisture condensating on surfaces or feeding mould and enabling it to grow and so on. But also at the same time, that general ventilation or background ventilation is stopping the build-up of other pollutants as well. Yeah. And this is the thing about air quality, is that we're focusing on damp and mould this week, but poor ventilation keeps bad company. Where we see bad damp and mould outcomes, we're also very likely to see bad outcomes with other pollutants as well. Mm-hmm. So general ventilation is a fundamental foundation, a really important pillar in, if those risks are going to exist in the built environment, that we've got a way of diluting them reliably so that they don't ever get to a level where we see a problem. And that's a measurable number. That's a thing that we can calculate and determine in a building, that says, based on either the size of that building or the amount of people that are likely to be in that space, so the amount of pollutants that they'll generate, in this case this week we're talking about moisture, how much air does that building need effectively to be healthy? That's the general ventilation rate, and it's a measurable number. It's a thing that we can determine. And what happens is as we're talking about retrofit, as we retrofit buildings and make them more airtight, we remove more and more of the unintended ventilation, the leaks through the windows and the fabric of the building, and we rely more and more on those systems to deliver that background general ventilation rate. So it's really, really important. The second pillar is local exhaust ventilation or extract ventilation, and that's where we recognise that certain activities in certain spaces of the property generate significant amounts of pollution when they occur. So think of rooms like the kitchen, the bathroom, a utility room, a WC, all create different types of pollution events, cooking events, moisture events, odour events and so on, that we recognise that we may need to extract that pollution at source at a rate that stops that pollution spreading to the rest of the property. So that's the second pillar, and again a really important pillar. And often those two are combined. So the thing that extracts the pollution in the rooms where it occurs is often the thing that's driving the background rate as well. So they're often go hand in hand, and they might be different rates for different things, but again, often it's measurable. And the third pillar, which is more about events, things like overheating or decorating or DIY, is what we call purge ventilation. And that's effectively, in plain English, our ability to throw a building wide open, opening windows, opening doors. If we, think decorating, if you varnish the floor and you want to clear the room. But the extract ventilation and the background ventilation are the two principal pillars that we rely on every day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, to protect us, to protect our health and well-being. And the challenge that we have is that when we go out there into the wild of the built environment and see how we're doing with those two elements, we're not doing very well.
Most people don't even realise the impact that poor air quality has. I think that's one of the key things.
Yeah, and also if you think traditionally where we've come from ventilation, still the vast majority of our ventilation in the UK is derived from what we would call natural ventilation. So that is the trickle vents in your windows and the holes in the wall you might find underfloor and so on. And it's quite hard to measure. So it's been we quantify it by the amount of them that we install and which rooms they're in. So it's a harder thing to measure. But increasingly, as we move towards mechanical ventilation, it becomes much more quantifiable how much general ventilation we're providing or how much background ventilation we're providing. And that's where we're starting to see failures. When we actually go out there, because we don't think about it very often, when it comes down to it, the amount of holes that we find in buildings and in what rooms, the amount of undercuts and the ability for air to move from one space to another, so that's the gaps under your doors in your homes, and the fans that we have in our bathrooms and kitchens and so on, we find time and time again aren't big enough, there aren't enough of them, or they're not moving as much air as we thought they should do. And the cumulative effect of that is we find very, very high levels of what we would call non-compliance. So buildings not meeting this minimum benchmark of what's considered by regulators to be a safe level of those kind of principal pillars. And that's a fundamental problem we have to fix, because it's a significant contributor to the ability of moisture to build up over time in a building.
Yeah, and sometimes you get it's that kind of trade-off, isn't it? Like you mentioned, you talked about retrofit and how that can sort of worsen things. So it's, in trying to do something better, if you don't get the ventilation side of it right, you can really cause massive damp and mold issues. And I know I've seen some people release stats around how their EPCBs are their worst offenders, which is crazy because they probably spent 50 grand making them an EPCB, and it's like now they're mold offenders. You've got overcrowding, which is a big issue in the sector. It's getting worse, but it's not just this sector. It's like, we talked about it earlier on, but kids living with mum and dad more till later on, and we've got a sort of housing crisis across the board, and people can't afford to get their own places. So that's just becoming more and more of an issue. And I even remember, and then there's that trade-off of having like space under doors for ventilation in the house, but then like fire risk between rooms as well. And I remember when COVID happened and they were trying to get kids back into school to save the mental health of all the parents at home with them 100% of the time, which I was one of. One of the advice, or one of the sort of guidance I think in Scotland was to cut off 6 inches of the bottom of each door, so you'd have a huge wedge cut off in the classroom, which would probably improve academic outcomes even without COVID because of the CO2 stuff, which we won't go into. But the fire risk of that hadn't been considered, and that's was a massive issue at the time. So there's difficult trade-offs sometimes. Yeah,
but all solvable. The air transfer between spaces within a building is a fundamental pillar. The best way to view it is like the circulatory system of the body. Without an ability to move air from one space to another, you can't effectively ventilate a building. And it doesn't matter what system you're talking about, whether it's mechanical ventilation with heat recovery or natural ventilation with intermittent fans, they all require air to move fairly unobstructedly through a building. But of course, we have to balance that with fire risk and fire safety. but that doesn't mean it's not achievable. So where you have a fire door, for example, if you've got a compartmentalised part of the building, there are air transfer devices that can be installed indoors or above the head of doors that provide that free area required to move air from one space to another, but have intrumescence in them or dampers in them, depending on the compartmentalisation requirements, to protect the homeowner. So it is doable, but I can count on one hand the amount of times in my entire career in the residential sector I've seen appropriate air transfer devices in those scenarios.
It just gets worse, doesn't it?
We just ignore it. We just say, well, look, we can only get away with a 2 or 3 mil undercut under the door because it's a fire door, and we'll just ignore the ventilation. But the challenge we're finding increasingly, and damp and mould is a really good example of this, is that there's a level of scrutiny being brought to bear now on the performance of buildings and the outcomes that we're trying to deliver. That means we're not going to get away with that anymore. And this is where I talked about at the beginning, where we're in this point of time, I think, with damp and mould. What we've seen over the last couple of years is what I would call the first phase, which is the recognising you've got a problem phase, and we've had to go out there and do the big stock condition surveys, and we've had to try and report back to the ombudsman or the regulator quite how big a problem we've got, what processes we've got in place, the start of the stats on how we report and how quickly, so Arab's law is mostly around the governance and reporting, how quickly are we going to act, how do we communicate that, how do we respond. But we haven't gone to phase 2 yet, which is the what next question. And that is, when we've done these stock condition surveys and we now recognise we've got a big swathe of our stock that isn't performing, what does the fix look like? And there we go back to these 4 pillars, where we know we've got fundamental problems with the building fabric because of years of underinvestment in social housing. We know we've got fundamental problems in ventilation. Every time we survey this, that we find really poor outcomes. We know we've got issues with behaviour. It's not a lifestyle. It's just a case of living in properties generates lots of moisture, but we need to find a way to communicate that risk to people that live in homes so that they have some agency in outcomes here. And this is something I think that's misunderstood often in the nuance of risk in the built environment, is we have to keep agency with the people that this matters to, and that is tenants and homeowners, that they feel that they have an impact in their own outcomes. Because without agency, we find it very hard in almost all risk environments to get the outcomes that we're looking for. Homeowners must feel that they have a part to play in outcomes. So that balancing communication and how we communicate risk is critically important. And we've got the context piece, which we didn't talk about, which is the broader macroeconomical, environmental context that none of us have control over. And in the last couple of winters, we've seen that with a cost of living and fuel crisis, where it doesn't matter how well your systems perform and your building fabric perform. If you can't afford to heat your home, there isn't a surface.
That's becoming a bigger issue in itself, which is a challenging thing, and something that landlords can help with, but it's a very difficult thing. I mean, in terms of just the kind of base knowledge of it, it wasn't until really getting into this kind of air quality space over the last several years. Before that, hadn't really done anything about PM 2.5 or anything. And it's only reading those studies and then having a sensor and seeing what happens whenever I cook something or make some toast, and you see the level of the pollutants in the air, and then what impact that has on your health long term. And those two things together, as simple as it sounds, I never used to put the hood on the cooker, but as soon as I knew had that information, and I could see it, because it's not visible normally, but as soon as you can see it from a impact point of view, that extractor goes on every single time, and I'm chasing family members around the house if they've not put it on when they're cooking. So I do think there is an element of kind of just knowledge, and I think it's not, and like you say, agency is really important. There's obviously a lot more landlords can do as well. I think ventilation is a great catch-all as well, in terms of just if your outcome's improving health, that's what you're trying to do, then regardless of what the root cause is, then I think stronger ventilation will have some positive effect.
But we're going to have to get serious about this problem, Chris, because we are moving on to the what next question phase now of the damp and mould challenge. It isn't about knowing how big a problem we've got, and it isn't about knowing whether the right governance structures are in place. That's kind of largely been done, always being worked through by the housing organisations and the ombudsman and the regulator and so on. That doesn't take away from the fact that housing organisations are significantly under-resourced, and we've got a really big problem in the built environment. So what does the roadmap look like? And, you know, I think we forget, you know, I'm in a bubble of ventilation and air quality, I recognise that. That's just one of the many fights that housing has got on at any one time, right? So it's fighting for resources and bandwidth and space the whole time anyway, even in the larger context of housing. But nonetheless, even if you focus on damp and mould, there's a whole spectrum of problems out there where we have to start figuring out what our risk assessment processes are and how we start to tackle and fund and resource the fixes. And the fixes is not going to be doing what we've always done, particularly from a ventilation perspective. You know, we get ventilation wrong over and over again because we're repeating the same mistakes that we've made in the past, because we've not based our decisions on performance outcomes. We've based our decisions on product specification and whether a fan was installed and switched on or not is it doing what it's supposed to do.
So do you think that's some of the major issues there are landlords that have maybe installed fans that on paper look like they have the right kind of, you know, the 15 litres a second or whatever it might be, but actually in the real world, in the real conditions with, you know, the ducting that they've got in or whatever it might be, they're not actually performing how they should, and that's where this study is showing that this is underperformance. Is that what you're thinking?
Even worse than that, I would say the vast majority of housing providers' success has a fan been installed and turned on? The question of even the performance of that fan may not have even been discussed. A survey, you know, typically what happens is a survey will come in either because of a reactive maintenance process or a schedule or cyclical or void process, and you have a fan in a bathroom that's not working or looks old. There's evidence of damp and mould in that property, and that fan will be scheduled to be replaced. And what happens is that on a list for a contractor, it goes replace bathroom fan.
It's the same model goes in.
Or whatever the preferred supplier or product that particular trade is using. It's the one he gets the deal at down the local merchant, or has done a deal with a particular manufacturer, whatever it is. But at no point has anybody stopped to go, actually, what's the plan for this property as a whole? What's the broader context of this building's journey? What occupancy is it likely to have or does have? What are the challenges it's going to face? What does the right solution look like, either in part or in whole for the building? So, you know, classic example of that is kind of bathroom and kitchen replacements under void processes. They're done in isolation. So the kitchen contract will be to replace all the worktops and units and white goods and so on, and update the bathroom fan. And it will be, that decision will be made in complete isolation to the bathroom replacement or what the building might need from a general maintenance perspective. And successes, as you kind of joke, but it's true, has it been installed? Check. Has the electrician turned it on and certified that the electricity it's safe? Yes, check. And that's the measure of success.
But it should be the outcome.
The outcome. How much air, go back to the pillars, what is the general ventilation requirement for that property? Does this product deliver that? And who makes that decision? What is their competency to design that, figure out what that should be? And how do I check that I got what I paid for? Because the hard truth in ventilation in housing is that we're simply not getting what we're paying good money for. This is a consumer problem, the housing provider being the consumer, in that, it's the best way to put this, that we're kind of expecting the supply chain to deliver a good outcome just because we ask them to do something. We don't have the processes in place and the strategy in place to set that up for success.
Yeah.
Our measure of success is all wrong. And I know that, and it red flags in nearly all of the conversations I have with housing organisations, is often their first question to me when I talk to them is, what do you think of that fan?
Yeah.
Or what do you think of that manufacturer? And that in itself is immediately the wrong question to be asking. It says that the focus is on the product, not the outcome.
Not the outcome.
And I imagine that's resonating with a lot of your listeners almost immediately.
Yeah.
Is that my first question is, am I choosing the right fan?
Yeah.
And that's instantly the wrong framing.
Probably looking at costs, and if the brochure says X, Y, Z regulations, then it's a cost thing. But do you think? Are landlords kind of, from what because I know you do a lot of work with landlords helping build ventilation strategies, which we could talk a bit more about later on. But from what you're hearing in conversations and when you're making these changes, are landlords currently following regulations? I assume they are, but maybe it's the regulations aren't. Well, they assume quite right, or
they assume the regulations a bit. See, often in kind of the asset management sphere, a lot of the buildings that you're working on won't come under a particular regulation or standard, because it's not, unless it's a major renovation or it's a new build, it's not going to come under building standards. So generally the language is pretty wishy-washy within the kind of the regulators for rented accommodation or social housing. It just talks in terms of plain English, thou shalt provide adequate ventilation for residents' health and well-being, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
Which is
fine.
fine.
Some of the HHSRS has ticked off on that.
Yeah, it's true.
Well. Yeah.
It's true. But what there isn't in there is a definition of what that looks like, what success is, what performance you should expect.
Yeah.
So a lot of the work you end up doing with housing organisations is setting that up, like saying, okay, with or without standards or regulations, what is a measure of success for ventilation? Where's the line in the sand for us? What are we saying is a good outcome?
Yeah.
And how do we then build policies and workflows around that so that we can get that? And I think that's where a lot of the anxiety is for housing organisations, is that they don't really know what good looks like.
Yeah.
So the story is, and it's one that will probably resonate with many, is that they've cycled over the last 5 years or 10 years through various manufacturers, through various system types, PIV, DMEV, extract systems, this manufacturer, that manufacturer, and they're kind of still in the same boat that they were 5 years ago, and now they're wondering, really, do they really know what good looks like? And it's quite stressful, because you're just you're spending money replacing fans and not really sure why you're not getting the outcome that you want. Because it's part of a big complex piece anyway. Even if you get ventilation right, it doesn't mean you're going to get a good moisture balance outcome. There are three other drivers there that could tip that out of balance for you. So you need to be sure that what you're doing is doing that pillar well, because you can't rely on the others. Other things may influence an outcome. But also, the same old stuff has been replaced year on year and year, and it doesn't seem to matter what brand it was or what system it was, we're still getting problems. So
just the spec's not quite right, but they kind of think it's right, so they keep replacing it with a different brand maybe, but it's the same spec. And so maybe that advice would be, it sounds like, one, think about ventilation from a strategic point of view. Don't just bolt it onto things. It needs to be thought about, at the big picture point of view, and have that kind of culture around it. And then the second thing would be to sort of maybe over specify or kind of fit ventilation to sort of a higher standard than you think is required from a regulatory point of view, or what might be there in the current best practices. Maybe
that's a really good point you make, actually. If you think. Ventilation, in essence, is what we call an engineering control for risk. Right. So under the hierarchies of control, when we talk about pollutants or hazards in a space, the primary way of removing hazards is to either eliminate or substitute those hazards. So a good example is combustion devices. If we don't want combustion products in the home, if we move gas cookers and put in electric ones, that's that risk eliminated, right? So that's the most effective way of reducing risk. But with things like damp and mould, we're effectively relying on engineering controls. We can't eliminate mould spores from the built environment. They will always be there. In fact, we need them for the environment to be healthy. You know, there's the microbiome of our built environment is necessary. So it's not about eliminating damp and mould. We just don't want too much of it. We don't want an unhealthy balance of it. So engineering controls are all about putting something in place that reduces that risk. In all other levels of engineering, when have you ever heard of somebody looking at the structural integrity of a steel beam, working out exactly where the breaking point's going to be and specifying a beam at that breaking point?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Right? They'll always introduce...
Yeah. It's like a third over normally.
Yeah, it's that classic engineering joke. You calculate exactly what's needed and then you double it. Just to be sure.
Yeah.
Right? But we don't do that in ventilation.
Yeah. That's because of the unknown, like extreme sort of potential events.
But is indoor environments any different?
Yeah.
So we have a minimum building regulation.
It's a house for 3 people, but actually there's 7 in there for some reason, and you can't put them anywhere else.
Yeah. So we've got a minimum standard. You work out what the bare minimum is based on a very broad set of assumptions of what we think the ventilation should be, and then we specify products and fans just to meet that minimum because we don't want to spend any more money on something that does a bit more.
Yeah. So actually 20 quid more could save you like tens of thousands in damp and mould issues, and more importantly than that, the health outcomes of potentially a whole family that live there.
Completely.
Yeah, so I think it's just that's a great piece of advice right there.
Capacity.
Over specify ventilation, and you'll save money in the long run.
We talk about it's about capacity. What capacity does is it introduces a level of protection into design that caters for inevitable failures within the supply chain. Yeah. And the supply chain is long, so there's plenty of opportunity. If we set our goal to be the minimum, any failure in the products, the design, the installation, the commissioning, the use, environmental conditions that we couldn't cater for or perceive was going to happen, the automatic outcome will be not meeting that minimum. And that is why when we do these surveys, we see such high levels of non-compliance, because the target is the bare minimum, effectively. Yeah. Whereas if we say, and this is funnily enough what's happened in Ireland, under the building standards there, whatever your design calculations are for this general ventilation rate, the system has to have the capacity now to do 25% more than that.
That makes sense. Yeah.
Right. So if your general ventilation rate is 30 litres a second, you end up having to have 34 litres a second whole house potential. It's not that you set it there. It just means if you come along after the fact and the installation was a bit iffy, or it wasn't quite the product you thought it was, whatever it is, you've got a little bit of gas in the tank that you can turn it up or achieve
when you
what
get some dust in it and it slows it down. Like because one of the sort of aspects that we're hearing a lot is just the maintenance or the sort of wear and tear. So if you're specifying it's like a minimum standard, it's just you're going to have issues long term. And I think the sector's seeing it. We've seen it in the research now. Ventilation is obviously a really key factor. So
there are several things a housing provider is obligated to do, and that's to provide adequate ventilation. So we can't expect a homeowner or tenant to do their part if we're not doing what we should be doing. And the evidence suggests there's a higher chance than not than the buildings, the assets that you've got are not doing what they should do. So the onus is on us to deliver that. The reality is that it's probably what the supply chain should have been doing all along. It's what we've certainly been paying them all along to do. Often the shifts that we're asking here to get a better outcome aren't an extra cost on us. It's just us reframing what our expectations are so that we actually get what we're paying for. Yeah. The trouble housing providers have is that they do not have the bandwidth, time and resources to micromanage the bit in the middle. It's too messy, there's too much whataboutery, it's a messy place to get involved. They can't be on every site arguing the toss over which brand of fan goes in or not, right? Just not going to happen. So what we tend to do is bookend the process from a quality assurance perspective. So we clearly define our design expectations, what we expect when somebody is a designer, what we expect them to do and what we're going to hold them accountable for. So the moment somebody's making a choice about what ventilation fan to put in, they are the designer. And what are our expectations of them at that point? What information do we want on record about their decision-making process? We let the supply chain deliver to that design, and we have a QA process at the end, the other bookend, that checks that we got what we paid for.
Yeah.
And we can let the supply chain fight it out in the middle as to whether it's a Ventaxia fan or an Envirovent fan or whatever. Like, they can sort that out amongst themselves.
Yeah, it's measuring performance.
There's a accountable design and a measurable outcome.
Yeah.
And that's almost the same in almost all other forms of engineering, actually, when you think about it. And that's the key, I think, to success, is just reframing that from how many fans have we installed this week on those voids to who made the decision, what was the performance determination, and have we got a document that says it met that design?
Yeah, that's the key thing is it doesn't meet it. And I think, when triaging damp and mould cases, if the landlord has the tool to measure performance of ventilation, it should be one of the first things that you do. It shouldn't take too long. It's something that if it is massively underperforming, you should just replace it and put something that's over-specified in, because regardless of, even if the root cause is, maybe a leak, obviously, which it would need dealing with, it's just straight away that will, improve the conditions long term anyway. And it also, de-risks in the short term whilst you're fixing a structural issue, because you're ripping more of the, not only damp and mold pollutants, but also PM 2.5, VOCs and everything out of the atmosphere. So
that's a really good point you make, and
you can't go wrong with more ventilation, essentially.
Yeah, or the right amount, and this is what's misunderstood, I think, is that damp and mould is front and centre at the moment because it's visible. It's one of the only visible manifestations of poor ventilation, because we see it. It creates an unsightly and costly building fabric problem that we have to resolve. All of the other pollutants that are arguably much more harmful, actually, to our long-term health and well-being than damp and mould are invisible.
Yeah.
We don't see them. The good news is most of the engineering controls that we put into place, these kind of 3 pillars of the intent of ventilation, if you like, solve those problems as well.
Exactly.
Largely.
Yeah.
The things that generate moisture are often generating the pollutants that we're concerned about as well. So there's good news across the board if we get ventilation right. And the great news is there's an awful lot of low-hanging fruit out there. We only have to tweak often the processes, our strategies and policies and workflows to get better outcomes. It's not like we have to invent a new technology here, or there's a big unknown.
Yeah.
We know how to fix this. We've just got to take it seriously enough to want to fix it, and that's the challenge. And part of that starts with us defining as an organisation what we consider success. What does good look like for us?
It's that having a strategy, that big picture sort of aspect, I think, is so important. Not just from the practically what we're doing and thinking more deeply about ventilation as a core element of healthy homes and the damp and mould, overall damp and mould strategy. But also, I think just from a cultural point of view, if you're an organisation that has a ventilation strategy, it means you are thinking about it, and you're more sort of careful when sort of specifying, I think, with manufacturers and things like that.
And I think it sets you up for the new world, which is that the built environment is measurable now.
Yeah.
So whether we like it or not, we're on this trajectory towards measurable environmental conditions. Aico, at the bleeding edge of installing environmental monitors that can tell us very well what the moisture balance of that building is.
Measuring outcomes. We're seeing more and more like large landlords just rolling out across the stock, and then having almost sort of changing culturally and process-wise to sort of assess their own performance based on the sort of like the living conditions, the healthy. Whether conditions are healthy or not. Obviously, if you have a structural issue, you can see that in sort of persistently raised humidity. Whereas if you have conditions that are really excellent, it's going to be a pretty good place to live. Because if you've got normal people producing, doing normal things in a home, you're going to have high humidity. If that humidity is at a normal level, it means the ventilation's good. And if the ventilation's good, it means the air quality is good. So, if you really want to deliver healthy homes, you need to have to complete your control system, be able to measure those outcomes. And I think that is something that I think sensors will help with. And one of the reasons that they'll continue to hopefully be useful, I think, into the future.
And they help validate the efficacy of those interventions importantly as well.
That's the key thing, really.
And that's the reality.
How much did that ventilation have an impact?
Yes.
Has this manufacturer, this manufacturer's specifications the same as this one? But in reality, which one works? Yeah.
I think brands will live and die in the very near future based on the ongoing performance
actual measured outcomes of this block of houses has poor internal conditions, like in terms of measured performance versus this one. Then
and if you're a brand, and it's not your fault, it's the installation processes or the governance or the costing and how the tender was set up, I'm afraid you're the brand that's left on the wall. Where in 2 years' time, when there's been 2 winters of damp and mould problems, who's going to be blamed, right? Very quickly, housing providers will look down through their list of spends and find that homes in column A with this particular brand have got problems. Whether it was your fault or not, you'll find your brand not being used. So it represents a real risk to the supply chain as well. But I think
focuses them on outcomes, though.
Yeah, completely. Yeah. But importantly for housing providers as well, this the data provides us with enormous value in understanding where to prioritise our resources, because this isn't if 75% of our homes are underventilated. Let's just say conservatively half of our homes need to be fixed in some way from a ventilation perspective. There's no way on earth that housing providers are going to be able to, in the next 10 years, fix all 50% of those.
Yeah.
Right? So we're going to have to prioritise.
Yeah.
And often what poor ventilation does is amplify bad outcomes.
Yeah.
So in anyone, a good example of this is an estate I'm working on just west of Dublin. All 250, 300 homes are significantly underventilated, right? But all of them, because the predominantly there's a poor design of the system in all 300 of them. However, a third of those homes are fine. From a damp and mould perspective, that doesn't mean they're necessarily fine from an air quality perspective. There could be other things going on, it's just not visible. A third of those homes have got some problem or other. They're the middle ground, the meat of the bell curve that are just getting by. We need to figure out how to help these people because it's impacting their health and well-being. It's not a disaster from the perspective of the scraping mould off walls, but it's undoubtedly causing impacts to their health and well-being. And a third of those properties have got really big problems. What data does is it unpacks that for you and enables you to more strategically focus where you need to focus, understand what's going to come downstream, and track the history of properties to see that the interventions are effective, or also to track the trajectory of declining performance that people may move in or move out of properties. You might see changes in performance over time.
That's really true.
And the data enables you to pick that up as well.
Yeah,
so that's the world really exists.
That's one of the case studies. Rosie from Mid Devon had a case study like that. It was just very, very striking.
Yeah.
But I think there was a really early on. We did a case study with I think Grand Union Housing Group, and they had, I think at the time, sensors in I think it was a couple of hundred homes or something. And they completely changed their ventilation specification based on, looking at data and the actual outcomes. So you just reminded me when you were speaking a minute ago, it's an old case study now, but that was a big factor for them to sort of scale up. This is a huge, obviously just the tender or the cost of ventilation itself, would have been, I guess, millions. But the actual thing that you prevented by improving that ventilation is like an order of magnitude.
Yeah.
Greater than that, which is really interesting. So,
but I'd like housing providers to think about, in a world where we're measuring outcomes, right? Whether that's through data or through feedback and the normal feedback loops within the housing organisation, and we recognise that we've got problems in certain assets, and we start to, over the next few years, deal with the what next question. We start replacing bathroom fans, we start improving undercuts and making sure trickle vents are appropriate and working and so on. And we start spending money. We're spending money we don't have, literally, in trying to fix this problem.
Yeah.
And next winter the damp comes back and the mould comes back because ventilation...
It's been the story of the sector for years.
And even if you get it right, that's going to happen in a lot of cases. You're not going to... Ventilation is not the silver bullet for damp and mould problems in housing. It may be a significant contributing factor, but it's very unlikely to be isolated. Yeah. Right? So when damp and mould does come back the next year, how do you stand over that intervention? Either through the data or through the strategy and workflows that you've got to say that we identified that ventilation was a contributing factor, and the thing that we did to fix that, we can stand over with confidence that that was the right solution. Yeah. And that's the place that housing providers will find themselves increasingly in over the next few years, is as these properties now are much more focused on from a damp and mould perspective, as we start to intervene and look for better outcomes, is just repeating and rewashing the same thing we've been doing over the last 5 or 10 years. Is that going to fix it? It isn't. So we've got to start answering the what next question. How do we define what good looks like if ventilation is the intervention? Yeah. In the same way, how do we define that fixing the gutters or solving the rising damp or the leaky windows, what's the measure of success? Yeah. And increasingly the measure of success will be having a ventilation plan that we define a performance outcome, and we can walk away from that property with a document that says it's doing what we expect it to do. We can now park ventilation and concentrate on the other contributing factors. Yeah, because it may be partly the windows.
I do think. I mean, I really think, based on conversations, that ventilation is a big factor. Though it's one of the, even the root cause. Because and actually, and the reason I think that is because, historically, you would have heard a lot of landlords say things like, residents drying lots of clothes inside, for whatever reason, there's lots of people living there, drying loads of clothes on radiators, creating loads of humidity, or the way people were washing was creating lots of humidity, and there's kind of like there's a lot of blame towards residents. And obviously there are things people can do to improve conditions, but the reality is, if people have to do those things, they have to live in the house, and particularly if there's a lot of people living in a small place, which is happening more and more, or they can't afford to buy a dryer or use a dryer, or they're living in a flat, so they can't dry clothes outside. There are sometimes situations where that people need to do these things, and if you're a landlord and you're not thinking about it, from a fatalistic point of view, as the Ombudsman would say, what can you do in that environment? I've heard of situations where people have actually just bought like a condenser dryer and stuff like that. But in those situations, if you're in a small flat and people are drying clothes, a lot of clothes inside because there's a family in there, and it's creating more moisture than history, you could say the root cause is the people drying the clothes. But what I would say is, ventilation is arguably the root cause, because the ventilation might meet building standards or best practice, but if you vastly improve that, then it would pull that moisture out, or at least if you had that kind of level of power.
Again, it's a spectrum, right? So what we're trying to do with engineering controls, ventilation being the significant pillar here, is deal with most typical examples, right? And that's not lifestyle, that's people living in homes. Yeah. And adequate ventilation, decent ventilation, is quite capable in a well-heated home to dry any amount of clothes that a family wishes to dry in the living room, the bathroom, the kitchen, whatever, right? In the same way that a decent ventilation should be quite capable of dealing with all the cooking pollutants. It's one of the most common ones. Well, I've got families from different ethnic regions that have different cooking habits and so on. And we're going, well, surely we're encouraging cooking in the home. Most of us hark back to a time when our mum was doing stock on the stove and doing home cooking, and we were trying to encourage this kind of healthy home eating lifestyle. So adequate ventilation should be able to deal with 90% of the scenarios that we throw at it comfortably. That's kind of the idea of having robust background ventilation, decent local exhaust ventilation, and some inbuilt capacity to do more than we might normally do if that building is under some pressure because of the amount of people that are living in there or cultural behaviours or whatever it is, that we've got that inbuilt. That's a strategy, basically, right? It never deal with the edge cases, and nor should it be. We can't create engineering solutions for all scenarios. But what we need to be able to do is leave a building in a scenario where we've done it. Like, it's about risk, and risk, you can't eliminate risk. I think the statement is, am I doing everything that can be reasonably expected of me today to limit the risk to a reasonable level?
Yeah, I mean,
and as a housing provider, if I've done that gives the agency to the tenant to play their part to deal with the edge case.
Yeah.
Or our other services, so the good example is the fuel poverty, where homes just can't be held at a temperature where damp and mould isn't a risk. We can start to think about how we might intervene in other ways. But the building block is that we've got decent ventilation in the first place. Then we can start to ask tenants realistically, well, look, because of, we can't do anything about the density of occupation here, but can we suggest that we start drying clothes in the wet areas of the property where those rooms are best designed to meet that problem? That we start introducing habits of closing bathroom doors when those wet clothes are in there, or when we're taking showers and baths, that we're putting lids on pots, that we're using the cooker hood, that we've got information about why that's important, that we start to build up those tools for people to manage those spaces in those edge cases.
Yeah.
But we should be able to walk away realistically from most properties where a tenant, a family, shouldn't have to alter habits and behaviour in order to get a good environmental outcome in that space. That's the goal.
Yeah.
Because we all dry clothes indoors.
Yeah.
We all cook with the lids off the pots. Yeah. We all forget to turn the cooker hood on. Like that's life. Like, we need to create an environment where there's enough background ventilation where we can limit the impacts of that when that inevitably occurs. And that's the goal. That's what adequate ventilation means.
Yeah,
it's adequate. It's not perfect. It deals with most scenarios in life. Yeah,
I think this. I mean, it's kind of, just made me think of it now, just talking there. But it's like, you think about it. If I think about this, the analogy from a fire safety point of view, you don't kind of have like flammable fire doors and say, well, it's on the resident to just don't create fires. Sometimes there are just things that happen, or unfortunate things that happen, or there's risk factors, or there's always that element of risk. So, are you doing everything you can do from a sort of built environment point of view? And sometimes that means going beyond what's in the regulations and hitting a best practice, which may or may not exist in ventilation. And I think that from a landlord point of view, obviously that's great, outcomes from a resident point of view, health-wise, but also I think that the ROI clearly. If you're spending £20 more on a ventilation system which has a much greater impact, then the cost that you would save over the lifetime of that fan could be in the tens of thousands. So it just seems like a no-brainer.
And there's a hidden cost. We mustn't forget the societal costs of the impact of damp and mould in properties, and broader indoor air quality impacts on society. That housing organisations don't exist in a bubble. Their ability to flourish and provide equitable societies for tenants revolve around the health and well-being of those communities. And if we're creating environments that are unhealthy or not delivering what they should do, it not only costs us money in remediation and lost rent and all of that, but it impacts society's ability to work and educate and contribute to society, which ultimately affects their ability to pay rent and to exist in a happy and constructive way within the societies and communities that we create. So there's a hidden cost here that's
Yeah.
enormous, and that manifests in lost days to school, lost days to
So
work.
limited social mobility. If
Yeah.
you're a child growing up in a sort of environment that's unhealthy, can't concentrate as well at school, you're more likely to have autoimmune issues, it's difficult to do homework.
Yeah.
You know, all these things have a big impacts later on in life as well. And I think that's,
Yeah.
you know, for me, you know, obviously I've got young kids. It's something that, you know, it really does. It does that element of it, you know, really hits home for me.
And look, the good news here is that we know how to fix this. That there's a lot in environmental science where there's a lot of unknowns. There's a lot of air chemistry and things going on where there's a lot of uncertainty about what the right decisions are. You know, just think of sustainability and global warming, for example. You know, it's a very complex world out there. But ventilation and engineering controls and risk of things like damp and mould, we know how to fix this. There aren't any unknowns. We have a lot of the information and tools we need to get the better outcomes now. We've just got to figure out how we deploy that in the right way, how we communicate that, and the questions that we're answering. And that's the good news. This isn't like we're looking into a deep void of uncertainty here. This is a process.
It's solvable.
Yeah, and you know, we take the mickey about over kind of checkboxing exercise, but effectively what we're trying to do is move housing organisations into a place where they can check the box and say, ventilation, check, we've done it.
Actually, yeah.
I can move on
Outcome
to some
check.
of the other bigger problems that I've got. And that's the goal here, is that this isn't an uncheckable box. That's the great thing.
Yeah.
We can, and and it's true. I see this on the faces of the asset managers and the people that I work with on a daily basis, that when you put a process in front of them where they can actually finally check that box and go, I can walk away from that property knowing I've done all I can to solve that problem. We can now worry about the context and the occupancy and all of the other much more complex things that are contributing to these outcomes. But ventilation, we're done. If someone chooses to block it up or turn it off or interfere with it in a certain way or doesn't understand how to use it, that's another problem. That's something else. But we've left a solution in that property that does what it's supposed to do and does it in a way that it should be sustainable. That it doesn't
over a decade.
It doesn't need to be turned off, isn't making an unduly amount of noise. It is working when it should do in a way that doesn't disturb tenants. It's quite possible to create ventilation systems in properties of all flavours, you know, from decentralised MEV systems all the way to full whole house mechanical ventilation systems with heat recovery. All of them are capable of delivering good outcomes if approached in the right way. We've just got to figure out what that looks like.
Yeah.
And that is an enormous checkbox to be able to tick off and move on to some of the more nuanced problems.
Yeah, definitely.
It's
It's a massive thing, and you know, the fact that it can improve health outcomes from the other pollutants that don't get talked about, I think is going to have a really profound effect on society. I think the ball's rolling now. I think culture's changing, decisions are being made, money's getting spent. Hopefully, you know, the government seems to be, you know, it does seem to be quite high on the agenda, both housing and then this aspect of housing, like the health of homes as well as building. Yeah. So hopefully we're in the right way. I think so. Just put you on the spot and try and get you to summarise bring it back to the original question, the sort of 2 or 3 pieces of advice that you'd give to social landlords. Obviously, we're ventilation focused, but what piece of advice would you give them to summarise?
That you can't manage what you don't measure, and whether that's through data and the environmental conditions through the likes of the Aico systems and HomeLink, or whether you're measuring the performance of the ventilation systems, ultimately you don't know what you're dealing with unless you can measure it. So reframing your perception of what a good outcome is based on performance, whether that's environmental performance or ventilation performance, the point is that you can start to determine what good looks like based on actual metrics of something, a measurable outcome. So I think that's number one, is that understanding we've got to just pivot, and it doesn't take much, but just pivot to what good looks like in our built environment is enormous. Start to develop language and framing about why we're doing this and why this is important, so that we can not only communicate it effectively internally within what are often quite embedded business processes within housing, that we need to start reframing why we care about this, and how, you know, the housing ombudsman and the it's not a lifestyle is a very big part of that whole reframing. Why we're doing this is really important, so that communication piece. And they're the two big ones for me, really. And thirdly, and equally to both of those first two, is recognising that we've got a problem in the first place.
Yeah.
That from people that are looking at this objectively, not just people with a vested interest like me who have a focus on ventilation and air quality, but anytime this is looked at academically or from a government perspective with government-funded research, we find we've got major gaps in performance in ventilation. So we have to start from this place, this honesty, that there's a good chance that there's a higher chance than not that any one asset is going to be underperforming from a ventilation perspective. If we can start there and not just assume that because we've got a cyclical stock condition survey every 5 years and all of the apartments and houses in that stock condition survey had a bathroom fan in them that was working, that's a good outcome, and recognise that there's a good chance that probably 50 to 75% of them are underventilated. That gives you a good clue as to where some of the problems that we're seeing are coming from. And I think that's really important. Like most problems, recognising you've got one is the first part in the journey. The second part is being able to measure how big a problem that is, and then having the strategy and tools to then navigate your way and diminish that risk over time. And this is going to be a long journey, so you know it's important that we have a plan. You know, and I think data will be a very big part of that increasingly.
Yeah, it seems to be. I think that kind of like viewing ventilation, the bigger picture point of view is really important. Just based on what we're seeing with more of that. Obviously we're kind of involved with people who are identifying root causes, measuring the impact of different interventions, and ventilation seems to be key. So. Been really great to have you here to talk to you about that. You've got an unbelievable amount of knowledge about it. So Simon Jones, host of Air Quality Matters podcast, expert on ventilation, indoor air quality, also consultant to the sector on ventilation. Where can we find out more about you? Airqualitymatters.net, is it?
Airqualitymatters.net is where everything's held. The podcast, the consultancy,
Brilliant.
The training, all of that. So do feel free to check it out.
Cool.
And go from there.
Thanks so much for your time.
No problem at all. Thanks very much.
Cheers, mate.
Cheers. Thanks, Chris.